Hello, everyone, and welcome. I see that our attendance is starting to pour in. I'm so happy to see so many people joining us for our lecture tonight. We're going to have a great conversation. I'm super excited. I'm just going to give people another minute to log on. I'm Kate Lemay. It's a pleasure to be back in the Portal lecture series, hosting it. I do want to ask people to use the chat. It's so fun to see where people are joining us from. So I'm in Maryland. I'm just outside of DC. Sometimes people are as far as England. I'm not sure if is the chat actually, yeah, it's enabled. Yay, good. So people are in DuPont Circle, Manhattan, Lexington, Kentucky, near Austin, Texas. So fun. It's so good to see some familiar names and to make some new friends. I see Elizabeth Lee from Philly, Valerie Lee, Laura Smith, hi, Tanya Sheehan. Lots and lots of people are joining us all at once. This is awesome. So welcome. I'm just going to give you one more minute to join. Let us know from where you're zooming in. I'm glad that people aren't zoomed out. Maybe we all are zoomed out, but you're just being extra disciplined and joining us tonight. It's 5:01 p.m. in Eastern time. Great. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Kate Lemay. I am a portrait gallery historian. I use pronouns she, her. I'm the interim director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery Scholarly Center. Portal promotes the study of American portraiture and visual biography. It's increasingly disciplinary, and it addresses the field of American portraiture, which nevertheless remains underdeveloped in the United States. We especially seek to support analysis of the production of portraits, their uses, and their cultural meanings within global contexts. Portal fosters engagement with portraiture through the coordination of discussions like tonight, new research, scholarly publications on portraiture in all media and within various social and cultural contexts. Portal has sponsored lots of things, including symposia, online programming, and we hope to keep continuing conversations with scholars like tonight to help them get the word out about their new research. And all of this situates American portraiture and visual biography within these larger social, historical, economic, and political frameworks. Please keep an eye on our website for our programming. I think we're dropping it in the chat so you can see the link. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is important if you want to stay in touch. We would love that. We do have a YouTube channel, and you can watch tonight's lecture again if you wish. You can watch a whole program that we have of past lectures that you might have missed. We're very proud of our programming. We've had a lot of amazing people involved with talking with us about all aspects of portraiture. Again, please use the chat function. Let us know from where you're watching. And when we get to the Q&A session, you will use the Q&A function to ask questions that we can answer. And don't hesitate to put your questions in throughout the lecture as they come to you. That way, we'll have them queued up for our speakers at the end. So thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation, Portraiture and Slavery, Reflections and Resistance. This program will feature a conversation between scholars Adrienne L. Childs, John Stauffer, and Jennifer Van Horn. Although we are tuning in together from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We're so pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. And I just want to give a shout out to Susan Steinhauser for her amazing continued support. And we, of course, remember her late husband, Dan Greenberg. I also want to thank our Portrait Circle members who are here tonight in attendance. Thank you so much for joining us. Your support means a lot. So thank you so much for making that time. Okay. So I would like to introduce our guests. Adrienne L. Childs is an independent art historian and curator. She is an adjunct curator at the Phillips Collection and associate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Childs is co-curator of The Color of Anxiety, Race, Sex, and Disorder in Victorian Sculpture for the Henry Moore Institute. She was awarded the 2022 Driscoll Prize by the High Museum for scholarly work in African American art. She curated the exhibition Rips and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition 2020, which was at the Phillips Collection right here in DC. Her current book project is Ornamental Blackness, the Black Figure in European Decorative Arts. John Stauffer is the Cates Professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is the author, co-author, or editor of 20 books and over 100 articles, including Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, which is a national bestseller, as well as the award-winning Black Hearts of Men, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Picturing Frederick Douglass. His essays and reviews have appeared in Time, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Washington Post, as well as in exhibition catalogs, journals, and books. He received 3 teaching awards from Harvard and was named a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow. The Harvard class of 2021 voted him a, quote, Harvard favorite professor, which is so cool. He is curating an exhibition on Frederick Douglass for the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, which is scheduled to open in June of 2023 in just 5 months. So excited for that. Jennifer Van Horn holds a joint appointment as associate professor in the departments of art history and history at the University of Delaware. She is the author of Portraits of Resistance, Activating Art During Slavery, published by Yale University Press this past November, and The Power of Objects in 18th Century British America, published by the Omohundro Institute, the University of North Carolina Press in 2017. Jennifer was awarded the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery's Director's Essay Prize for her essay in the Art Bulletin in 2019. She recently co-edited a special double issue of Literature Portfolio entitled Enslavement and Its Legacies. She serves as the Vice President of Historians of 18th Century Art and Architecture, as well as on editorial boards for the Art Bulletin and the University of Delaware Press. So without further ado, please welcome our guests. If you could turn on your cameras, that would be great. And we are going to begin our slide share once more. And as soon as we do, we'll get this started, the party started. At the Portrait Gallery, this is what we were thinking of in preparation for tonight's conversation. Basically, we're often debating the definition of portraiture and what counts as a portrait. One way to parse out some of the various themes of portraiture and defining it might be to consider genre. In the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, photography was not considered an art form, but it was thought to be a portrait. Sculpture, during this era was more accepted as a medium of both art and portraiture. But then there's this tricky category of allegorical figures that were made after models. That's a little bit of a gray area. Oil painting is considered to be the most elite of art form during this period, and it prized accuracy and realness in the representation of people depicted. But the identity of sitters of African descent often was purposely erased. So starting with John, I'd like to ask our guests to discuss the difference between portraits and non-portraits, representation versus portraiture versus stereotype, and help us make our way through some of these sticky issues of how to define portraiture. John, I think you need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. We can't hear you yet.
Right.
Thank you.
Sorry. So thank you, Kate. I would start with Frederick Douglass, who wrote fairly extensively on photography. He was, so far as we know, the most photographed American in the 19th century. And he was one of the reasons why he was in love with photography is that he saw it as a truth-telling medium and also a democratic art. He wrote in one of his essays on art, what was once the most exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now within reach of all. The humblest servant girl may now possess a more perfect likeness of herself than noble ladies and even royalty could purchase 50 years ago. And he was accurate. He made a clear distinction between prints, prints that were a form of portraiture, and photographs, and also of prints that were cut from or based on a photograph, and prints that were freehand. His interest in portraiture developed beginning in the 1840s when he was still technically a fugitive slave. It was fueled in one sense by an engraving of Douglass that Douglass had no control over. It was published in this book called A Tribute for the Negro by a British abolitionist, Wilson Armistead. And it was, as I said, not based on a photograph, and Douglass had no control over its publication. And he publicly condemned it in his newspaper, saying that the engraver cast him as a happy slave, quote, with a much more kindly and amiable expression than is generally thought to characterize the face of a fugitive. He went on to say, Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hands of a white artist. It seems next to impossible for white men to take likenesses of black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features. And the reason is obvious. Artists, like all other white persons, have adopted a theory respecting the distinctive features of Negro physiognomy. And that critique was one of the reasons that drew him to photography. He had some control over the image. He treated the sitting for a photographer as what I call a pas de trois, a dance, so to speak, between the camera, the photographer, and Douglass himself as the sitter. And he believed in the truth value of photography vis-a-vis prints and other forms of portraiture. And he was also very selective in who he chose to photograph, and because he saw it as an intimate relationship between the photographer, the sitter, as I said, and the camera.
Thank you, John. John focuses on photography, but Jen, what about the angles that you might see from the perspective of oil painting?
Yeah, absolutely. First, just hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm really excited to hear John and Adrienne's thoughts, and my thanks to Kate for bringing us together. And thanks to all of our attendees for making the time to be with us today. So I wanted to start by thinking a little bit about how we understand portraiture historically. I think we oftentimes think about portraiture as being a representation of somebody's social identity, a recognition of a sitter's shared humanity. And oil on canvas portraits in particular, and you're seeing an oil on canvas here, as expensive luxury products often lent themselves to status definition. But with enslaved sitters, as scholars like Marcia Poynton have talked about, the portrait poses a contradiction. Because enslaved people were not legally recognized as having the right to have a social identity of their own choosing. Because they were enslaved, they did not have the freedom to refuse to sit for an image. And typically, they also did not then have control over what happened to that image of themselves. And these issues are very present with this really complex and I think very compelling image. This is a portrait of an enslaved woman known to us today only as Delia. So her surname hasn't been recovered. But this was a portrait commissioned by Delia's enslavers, the Bisland family of Mississippi. They commissioned the image from a Philadelphia artist, James Lambden, and Lambden had some family connections to the Bislands. From what we can tell, this portrait was then displayed along with representations of white family members at the family's plantation house. And we know Delia's identity today now because of her enslavement. There's a white family history that held on to her identity and that also held on to this portrait. It entered the Mississippi Museum of Art's collection only in 2018. This question about possession, who owns an image of someone else, gets even more complicated with this image because Delia was informally manumitted by the Bisland family. So her enslaver, William Bisland, died in 1847. He manumitted Delia's freedom from labor. So this was not a legally registered full emancipation or manumission. It stipulated that she was free from labor, quote, as long as her good behavior warrants. Despite that in between, informal, partial kind of manumission, the Bisland family held on to Delia's painting. So they continued to control her image despite the fact that they gave her a, well, I shouldn't say gave, right? Despite the fact that they were willing to recognize her freedom, albeit informally. At the same time that I am very cognizant of the fact that the people who commissioned and who owned this painting are in our thoughts and in our minds, I also think that as we look at this image today, we can unquestionably see Delia's self-possession, her individuality, and her pride. So I see that particularly as we think about Delia's head wrap, which you see here, known as a tignon, almost a kind of sculptural presence in this portrait, this folded yellow, green, and red plaid cotton fabric supplemented with a red ribbon. So the majority of free and enslaved women of African descent in the Gulf Coast region wore a head wrap. It was a legal requirement in Louisiana, but it was also a form of cultural expression, right? So this both recalled ancestral practices of head covering that were common in many African cultures, as well as being a specific kind of site for artistry. The way that a head wrap like this one was twisted and knotted was very specific to its wearer. So as we look at Delia's tignon now, we can see this as a very distinctive mark of her personality. So I want to encourage us then as we look at this image to also think about the way that the artist responded to Delia's self-fashioning, to her sartorial choices, which she made independent in some ways of who owned this portrait of her. And I also want to stress that the power that this image can have for contemporary viewers. This is now in a public museum space where I think we can encounter it then separate from the legal conditions and social conditions that shaped it when it was made. We today can very much recognize Delia's perseverance, her struggle, and see the portrait as honoring her memory, despite the fact that it was in fact paid for by her enslavers. So I am excited to hear Adrienne's thoughts. With Delia's image, we're looking at a very specific enslaved woman whose name is known. And it was experienced really only in the context of a plantation. But I know Adrienne's work on sculpture has talked about much wider circulation and viewership. So I'm excited to hear her talk a little bit about how these issues of identity and representation and race relate to sculpted images.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer, Kate, John. It's great to be here with all of you. And of course, as is always true to form with me, I am going far afield from where everybody else is, particularly since I'm working on European art, and I've been working on decorative arts, but most recently this exhibition that you mentioned that I'm working on Victorian era sculpture was something that I'm drawing from on what my remarks tonight. And what you're looking at is Charles Cordier's African Venus, and it's a sculpture that many of you probably know very well. And if you don't, you're never going to forget her. And it's by French sculptor Charles Cordier, done at the mid 19th century. And it to me represents, in terms of our consideration of slavery, a almost glamorization of female enslavement. Why is that? Well, first of all, what does this represent? She's called Venus African, African Venus. Cordier is a sculptor who's interested in ethnographic representation. He fashions himself as sort of a scientist / artist who wants to document all of the human races. And it's a tall order. He never actually does that, but it's something he embarks upon, and he wants to show the beauty in all of the different races. And so he engages with models. In mid-19th century Paris, there are Black models available, and we know more about that now because of the wonderful shows that have been going on last few years on the Black model in Europe. So one of the reasons why I'm even daring to put this into a conversation about portraiture is because it is drawn from life without question. And it's very individualized, but he does idealize, because that's part of his process, is to take the model and then tweak it so that it's the best that he thinks it should be. So again, this is probably the same for maybe not photography, but for painting as well. But at any rate, so I am calling this a sculpture. And how does it relate to slavery? Because he names it Venus Noire. Now, the Black Venus is a character. She, by the middle of the 19th century, she has become a sort of myth that dovetails between the two conceptions of the Venus, the classical goddess of beauty, love, and this notion of the African woman, the sexualized woman. So she embodies the kind of tension between those two kind of ideals that never really could come together, but in some ways do in this very salacious character of the African Venus that gets played out in art and literature throughout the 19th century, certainly in France and also in other areas in England as well. So she's called African Venus, but at some point, Cordier says she represents the abolition of slavery in France. He remembers her like that because they abolished it in 1848. And so he looks back on this as celebrating abolition or celebrating freedom. So, but what then how do we take the celebration of freedom, the conception of slavery in the body of a sexualized Black woman? We know that her, I have a lot of questions. I mean, was she enslaved? She certainly could have been formerly enslaved. Certainly her life was impacted by slavery in the Black Atlantic in the mid-19th century, even if she has come to Paris as a free woman. So her life is indelibly sort of intersecting with this issue of slavery, arguably the biggest issue of the 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic. But she, we looked at images of Delia. We looked at, for a minute, Sojourner Truth. We looked at Frederick Douglass. These are individuals whose lives have been mined. Truth and Douglass are activists. This woman, her identity stops here, right? So what does it mean to us? What are the tensions, what it means to idealize this notion of slavery in the portrait of an anonymous sexualized woman? I mean, that's what the problem is here. And one of the things that you asked me, Jennifer, well, I do have to just say, I know I'm probably going on too long, but the tignon that Delia wore, very fat. I mean, it's a lot of work has been done on that, but I couldn't help thinking about the contrast between the lush hair and naturalistic hair that Cordier captures in this woman. She looks very contemporary. I mean, I'm trying to get my hair to do that right now. It's not working. But so the what Cordier has done is very radical in many ways. The naturalism, and then you see this sort of freedom that comes with all of that, but it's really tempered and tampered down by the extreme sort of sexualization of her. And then she becomes sort of a decorative object. There are many replicas made of this piece, and it's also a companion piece to another sculpture of a male, but they become reduced, polychromed, made out of many different colors, and then disseminated as decorative objects, widely disseminated. So they become not just salon style sculpture, but they become commodities, and they go through this sort of process of industrialization in which sculpture is enhanced, if you will, during the 19th century. It becomes available to people to buy reductions, and she becomes, her journey becomes commodified. So, and how does that reflect a celebration, if you will, of the end of slavery? I just feel like it's fraught. And then the more I look at her, she's very beautiful, but the aestheticization of an enslaved woman in this is a callous disregard, I feel, and an obfuscation, as rather than what you were talking about, Delia, in the way she was in some ways celebrated and nurtured and held by the same family. This woman, the beauty and the compelling nature of it is countered by the aestheticization of slavery, which is something that as we all know, and people have written about slavery, is almost impossible to represent.
Jen, do you have a few responses, or Adrienne, or are you wishing to say a little more, Adrienne?
No, I mean, I would like to hear if anybody has a response.
Well, Jen, I was just because you were, this is a little off script, but you were talking directly to Jen's expertise on Delia, and I just thought maybe Jen would like to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate, I just appreciate Adrienne's work in general, and the way that I think in our pre-conversations, we talked a little bit about this too, that sometimes we have this idea that accuracy of representation is somehow intended on the artist's part to represent shared humanity. And just, and Adrienne, I feel like did just such an amazing job pulling out for us the kind of danger that lurks in assuming that because a representation seems to be realistic, that somehow it is recognizing someone's humanity and dignity. And I guess Adrienne's point just highlights for me too the difficulty of the Delia image, in that one of the phrases that has been used around history of photography is intimate possession. And so this idea that even this horrible complex entanglement of feelings of perhaps affection on the part of white enslavers at the same time as horrible exploitation, and the ways in which that's happening in a domestic environment. So I feel like those strands are in some ways also present in the Delia image of both oppression and, as Adrienne highlighted, celebration, and the horribleness is kind of in the way that they're both there.
Thank you. And, in our pre-meetings, we were talking about how people who were pro-slavery, or on the opposing side, abolitionists and activists in the 18th and 19th century used these images. So, these images were, in other words, used by abolitionists, but they're also used by pro-slavery folk. And Jen, do you see these uses as effective, or can you speak a little bit more, maybe it's problematic or both in representing people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have an image that I was hoping to share for our conversation. There we go. So I know this is an image that's really well known to those who are in Washington, D.C. It's at the National Gallery of Art. And just briefly to say how indebted my thoughts about it are to Ellen Miles and to Wendy Wick-Reeves, NPG curator extraordinaires. So this is just a very visually complex and gripping image. And it's very complicated in terms of the number of figures represented. So we've got George and Martha Washington, their adopted grandchildren, and then in the back, a standing figure who reads as appears to be an enslaved Black attendant. So this is a painting made by the artist Edward Savage between 1789 and 1796. So right at the beginning of the American Republic, this new independent nation. And it includes a plan of the future capital of Washington, D.C. On the table between the Washington family members. That gives you the sense of kind of futurity. And this painting from the beginning, first of all, it's really huge. For those of you who have seen it, it's monumentally large. It goes on display in Savage's Museum in Philadelphia. It goes into various museums in New York and Boston. So it's been on almost continuous display to the public from the time it was painted until the present. So it's a very public image. And it's also what I would think of as an anti-activist image in a sense. If we think about what was happening politically when this painting was created, this is painted in Philadelphia, where the president's house and where the nation's capital were located at that time. This was also a site of anti-slavery activism. So some people in Philadelphia were wearing those Wedgwood medallions produced in Great Britain. People were circulating the now famous slave ship icon print. So there was a lot of abolitionist imagery happening around this work. And yet, at the same time, we see George Washington as president and the federal government that he leads recommitting themselves to this institution of slavery. Both in the Constitutional Convention, 1787, which famously compromised to count enslaved people not as voting citizens, but as 3/5 of a person for calculating a state's population for representation in Congress. And also in 1793, when Washington as president signed a Fugitive Slave Act that put a legal system in place for enslavers and their agents to seize freedom seekers. They made it illegal to aid those folks, and they set a financial penalty for anybody who helped them. So this portrait, and then the many prints that were made after it in that political climate, I think is one that intentionally tries to naturalize enslavement. It promotes the economic benefit of enslavement to the Washington family personally, but also tries to suggest that slavery is beneficial to the nation's future. And that's a debate that we can think about in kind of big political terms, happening between politicians in Philadelphia's Congress Hall. But it's also happening within Washington's household as enslaved people are self-emancipating during these same years. And this is particularly, I think, potent around this image because we don't know for sure who the standing figure is in the background of this image. He's been given different identities over time, but I am proposing, and I think that it may represent Christopher Shields. Christopher Shields was enslaved by Washington. He was one of the 9 people that Washington brought from Mount Vernon to the president's house in Philadelphia. His story is one that's really bound up with Washington trying to actively manipulate and subvert the law in order to keep enslaved people from being free. So the Pennsylvania gradual emancipation law of this period said that enslaved people who stayed in the state for 6 months qualified for emancipation. The Washingtons then came up with reasons to rotate those enslaved domestic workers who they had brought to Philadelphia with them out of the state in order to keep them from being able to claim that freedom for themselves. We know that in 1799, after the presidency, Christopher Shields attempted to self-emancipate along with his wife, and that plan was foiled by Washington. So this image then is one that tries to make a claim for slavery as being important for a new America. It's also one, I think, that documents Washington's active attempts to keep enslaved people from freedom himself. So I think I get the happy task again of being able to transition us to Adrienne. And I know that we had thought a little bit about the difficulties of representing anti-slavery imagery and how images make a case for abolitionism. I'm hoping Adrienne will be able to tell us a little bit more about these fraught issues of anti-slavery imagery and how they go about making a case.
Thank you, Jennifer. And you're looking at John Bell's The Octoroon, which has been the subject of some wonderful scholarship recently by Mia Banuras and Caitlin Beach. And it is also in the exhibition that I co-curated at the Henry Moore Institute. And it got me thinking, and my other co-curators thinking about a lot of issues. And I have said elsewhere that it was very difficult to represent abolition and emancipation in 19th century sculpture. I mean, and I'm going to quote myself because it sounded good when I read it again. The various strategies used to represent the slave body in sculpture proved to be fraught with opaque intentions, contradictory messages, and open-ended narratives. And this one is very fraught and very contradictory. Now, how does it relate to portraiture? You know, we see the slippage here between portraying a type and portraying an individual. And this individual is a type, but it does intersect with our consideration of how slavery is portrayed. And so this John Bell is a British sculptor who's looking back in 1868 after the slavery has been abolished not only in the United States, but in England, of course, many years before, and in France. And so these are sort of memories, sites of memory of slavery, and they become very popular after abolition, which is really interesting, these fictions of slavery. And then again, how do we look at slavery as grafted on this, in this case, the nude, sexualized, captive woman who is a mixed race woman. She's a type of a slave, an octoroon. That means she has 1/8 Black blood. And this is a, you know, sort of a vexed product of generations of American enslavement and the types of enslavement that go on everywhere. But this one is specifically kind of referring back to America. But even though she's not a portrait, she portrays something very disturbing about the conditions of slavery in America. And part of her allure and her fatal flaw is that she looks white, right? But it's tainted, quote unquote, with Black blood. The visibility of this white female octoroon testifies to generations of forced racial mixing that left slaves and former slaves to exist at what was thought to be an impossible crossroads, not Black, not white. And so the octoroon is part of Bell's practice of kind of dealing with arousing abolitionist sentiment through the sexualized female body. He has another very famous piece as well. But this, we're focusing on this marble. So this octoroon has become fictionalized, right? And when slavery is conveyed through narratives and novels and in sculpture, these stories are truncated, they're mythologized, they're aestheticized. And they intend, while they intend to move the audience toward sort of abolitionist sentiments, they are inadequate. And they run the risk of sort of undermining the whole project, you know, sort of certainly the allure of this woman who's got long hair and she's rubbing herself, holding herself and looking down. She's certainly an answer to Hiram Power's Greek Slave, which was one of the most popular sculptures of the 19th century. So she's in that vein, but she's undermining the outrage because she's seducing us. There's a seduction element there. And so there's popularity of like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then there's a play, The Octoroon, who trade on these quote unquote, you know, tragic characters, and the other narratives that kind of elicit this pathos. But you know, racial mixing was in fact a real life situation in the colonial world, and it was the cause of a lot of not just anxiety on the part of Europeans, but a lot of tragedy, actual tragedy on the part of the actual humans who were part of this entangled system, whose the issues with it are still going on today. But so with the fairly limited materials of sculpture, you see him taking white marble and trying to sort of address this issue of the blackness, the drop of blackness in white marble. Now, what's interesting is this piece of marble is heavily marbled, if you will, with black veins in the marble in the piece. So Mia Bagneris has suggested that perhaps this piece of marble that had a lot of dapples of black veins, that was not the ideal at the time. Perhaps this piece inspired this image of a woman who is in fact of mixed blood. I don't, this is just something you can only think of right now, and think about how it resonates now, sort of a semiotic reading of it. It's hard to describe it as intent of the artist, but it's really interesting. What I feel like the last thing I want to say about this is the implication of both of these sculptors, the French sculptor, the English sculptor, investing themselves in these sexualized women who are, represent slavery. They do not, a system in which European or white men have been implicated, certainly in the figure of the octoroon, sexual violence, generations of sexual violence. They are removed from them with these aestheticized neoclassical, in this case neoclassical work. That it's astonishing to me how the implication of the white male, even though it's been generations since the English considered themselves enslavers in North America, this is still part of the system that they enacted. Certainly the French did in the Caribbean and in parts of the United States. So did the British. So they're removed from their implication in this tragic figure through the vehicle of art, of beauty, of narrative. So it's like I said, so how is this an abolitionist image? You tell me, but that was his intent. We do know that. And so it's about how not just English, European art is very, very different than we find in American representation of slavery at this time.
And I think there's a question for John that Adrienne wanted to ask about the path of boys.
About the what?
Yes, well, I was talking about, how Douglas, I'm thinking about how, this is a different kind of abolitionist image, but Douglas's whole project was abolition, and such an activist. It's every image that he did of himself aimed toward abolition, or how does he weave that in? What are the differences in his images?
So Douglas saw an intimate connection between photography and activism, and he in fact wrote on photography, as I mentioned, and he believed that true art, meaning accurate representational art, was an engine of social change. And he argued that true artists were also activists. And there's a disproportionately large number of photographers, of daguerreotypists and carte de visites in the antebellum era through the Civil War were anti-slavery, if not abolitionists. In fact, 90% of the photographs taken and circulated were in the free states, the northern states, partly because if you're a photographer, having a town or a city to do your business is going to attract people. There are very few comparative cities and towns. The South is an agrarian society. Very few cities, roads. The southern statesmen refused federal money to build roads and canals. It was because they realized if there was a strong infrastructure, it was easier for slaves to escape. So 90% of photographs came from the North, also because in the North, the artisanal ideal was central to Northern workers, men and women. In the South, that wasn't the case. The artisans in the South were enslaved people. So if you were poor white Southerners, your dream was to someday somehow acquire an enslaved person, have some land, and then the American dream for the white Southerner was to become a planter eventually. Very different from the artisanal North. Douglas, as he's in one essay that he wrote, he said that, as I said, I'm quoting him, true art was an engine of social change. He said, true artists are activists. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. And this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. So here's what is, here's what ought to be, and art can help you achieve this better self, this better society, a free society. So Douglas saw an intimate link between photography in particular and activism and reform. In this image of Douglas, as I said, he wanted control and had a fair degree of control over who he chose to sit for him. The image on the right is by John White Hearn, who was a Philadelphia, when Douglas first met him, he was a Philadelphia photographer. Hearn photographed Douglas more than any other photographer. There were 9 separate photographs by Hearn, more than any other, more than Matthew Brady. And Douglas sat for all of the famous photographers, Matthew Brady and I can just Matthew Brady and let's see. Sorry about this.
When we can, I think actually we should open the.
Oh yeah. Can I just
discussion
can I?
up. Yeah, sure.
Can
Go
I
ahead,
just
John.
finish quickly? So Douglas sat for Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, John Howe Ken, etc. But this image was in 1862 during the Civil War, and it was fairly widely circulated. Part of the reason why John White Hearn was Douglas's favorite photographer is that Hearn was a telegraph operator as well as a photographer, also an abolitionist. Douglas was in 1859. That was the first photo Hearn took of him. He was in Philadelphia giving a speech, and at the very moment the John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, and there was a memo or a message sent to the sheriff of Philadelphia that Hearn, as the telegraph operator, received and was ordered to deliver it to the sheriff. And before doing so, he warned Douglas that he needed to get out of town, which he did. Douglas was implicated in John Brown's raid. And Douglas always, when he, in sitting for his photographs, this John White Hearn image is a representative pose in which he, through the Civil War, he would look chiefly directly into the camera lens, confronting the viewer, and as a way of insisting upon his equal citizenship. He wanted to project a visual voice of democracy. He always dressed up. He always looked sternly. He never showed a smile when he photographed. And his counterpart, can you go back to the Sojourner Truth image? Because Sojourner Truth, I think, is a kind of wonderful female counterpart to Douglas. So Truth also, I mean, she sat for a photograph almost whenever she could. She was, like Douglas, possibly more famous for these carte de visite images. This was during the Civil War, than for her actual presence at abolition meetings. She always, like Douglas, carefully chose how she was portrayed when she sat for the camera. Here she is depicted as a respectable middle-class matron. And that's true with virtually every extant photograph of Sojourner Truth. And she includes her famous maxim, "I sell the shadow to support the substance," which means that it links her image, her shadow, to her actual self or substance, and to the growing demand for photographs. her image becomes, in this particular case, an extension of herself and the nation. So if you look at the yarn on her dress, she casts herself as an extension and it's an embodiment of the nation. The yarn forms the contours of the Eastern United States. You see Maine, then you come down, you see the Florida Panhandle, you see parts of Texas are visible. The image, in a sense, then depicts her as a representative American woman, her piety, simplicity, her abolitionism, shaping the nation. And Douglas did the same thing in a very different way, insisting upon equal rights, insisting on a vision of democracy.
I love that. And he was so, like Truth, he was so specific about how, like you're arguing right now, you know, he had control. And Truth was a part of a larger group of women that were doing this, you know, the suffragists.
Exactly, yes.
But I want to thank you all three of you so much. We could keep talking forever, which I would be, you know, my pleasure to keep talking with all of you, but I do want to get to the Q&A. So John, do you feel that the carte de visite is a true portrait? This is from Susan Schmidt.
Carte de visites are a true portrait as opposed to a false portrait?
Yeah, I'm not sure. But...
I mean, carte de visites were hugely popular for a number of reasons. I mean, it doesn't have nearly the richness and the subtlety of a daguerreotype, but it could be mass produced, and especially the carte de visites become especially popular during the Civil War years. Soldiers, one of the things that virtually every Northern soldier carried were photographs. They marched with photographs, and it's a lot easier, frankly, to march with carte de visite photographs than it is with daguerreotypes or tintypes. So it was also much cheaper. It was much cheaper. And around the same time period, that's when Americans started collecting photo albums. And Frederick Douglass appears in countless photo albums. Photo albums then were similar to digital photo albums in the 21st century, photo albums in the 20th century, with one crucial difference. In the 21st century and the 20th century, photo albums were typically of people you knew, your friends, your family, your loved ones. In the 19th century, people collected photographs for their photo albums that they had never met, but were inspired by what they had written, what they had done. So there are countless Americans who own carte de visites of Douglass in their photo albums, who had never met him.
I think our director did her master's thesis on Emily Howland's photo album.
Yes, that's a brilliant
that's a great
book.
example, right? I love it.
Brilliant book.
The next question is for Jen. This is from Randy Summer. The Bisland family of Natchez, Mississippi, or is it Missouri? I'm MS.
Mississippi, yep.
I'm having a brain fart right now. Is that the right family regarding the Delia portrait that you're talking about?
It is, yep. It's the Bisland family right outside of Natchez. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Another person asks Jen, the painter seems to have an idea of the subject's thinking in this portrait of Delia. Is this a stretch or what do you think?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think I'm just so appreciative of John and Adrienne for drawing out the complexities in the difference between various kinds of situations in which people pose and how complicated that is. Because we've been thinking about Douglass and Truth and sort of control over image and control over pose. And I think with Delia, as with other enslaved sitters for paintings, it gets so tricky because we don't know to what extent they're able to control things. I think I feel confident with Delia saying that her clothing reflects her sartorial choice. I think, you know, I see a sense of her self-presentation in it, in her image, but I think the subjectivity question is just such a tricky one. I mean, I certainly see her as being recognized as a subject, but I see that today, right? So I think one of the complexities is also thinking about 19th century viewership and just the range of different kinds of people who are encountering images and what they're willing to see and willing to not see. Yeah, that's a great question.
Good. Okay. Thank you for that lovely answer. For Adrienne, an anonymous person attendee is asking about the Cordier. Is that a gold earring?
It's a patina, gold patina, probably on bronze earring. Yeah, and the jewelry, but in every different version, there might be a different kind of color patinas and colors. Sometimes the necklace, which is a necklace of cloves, right, which is an authentic, kind of North African object, and it might be colored, and then the drapery might be colored a different color. So there's a lot of patina happening in different versions of that work.
Adrienne, there was a comment in the chat, and I just thought it was interesting about the material that Cordier chose, and someone was objecting to that material as a representation of an African, and I just thought, well, Adrienne's thought very deeply about this. I mean, what do you think? Was that a choice that Cordier made about that?
Well, I think it more suitably, I mean, first of all, she is an African woman, a woman of black, black descent, I mean, African descent. There's no question about that, but bronze has been used since the beginning of time, the Bronze Age, to represent all kinds of different people. And certainly, so there's no mutual inclusive between bronze and race. But it becomes fraught when marble we started to represent Black people in marble in the 19th century. So marble is linked so heavily to the classical inheritance of classical Greek inheritance and superiority. I mean, right, racial superiority is tied totally up with white marble, but the bronze can be used for representing Black people and can be used for representing anything. And it's like an industrial revolution in sculpture and bronze sculpture in the 19th century.
I love that. Karen Lemay says, thank you all for your work on this great panel and contributions to the field. Any thoughts on Dayton Morgan's patented bust of Douglas, commodification of a presumably stolen visage for profit, enabled by a federal means through the US Patent Office, institutional racism of another kind?
Wow. I have no idea about that. John?
What year, when was this?
It's Dayton Morgan's patented bust of Douglas. Do you know anything about that? It's very specific, and it's coming from Karen Lemay, who knows everything there is to know about sculpture. So we can maybe get back to you, Karen.
Karen, put the link in the chat, Karen.
So I do know that there were. I know a little bit about this. Douglas, first of all, just in terms of his relationships to busts, the busts that he owned, that he liked, were busts from whom the sculptor he knew and he had a relationship with. And he recognized the way in which a bust, someone could create a bust of him without him knowing it, in the same way that someone could create an engraving or a drawing of him without him knowing it. And that upset him, that if not outraged him. And so he would publicly try to condemn that work and the artist. If I remember correctly, Douglas wrote a letter or two, was not happy about the sculptor who wanted to essentially appropriate Douglas without Douglas's say in it.
Exactly. Yeah, that would have upset him. For the man who desires control over his image.
Yes, he wanted control over his image.
Absolutely.
And that's why he was so suspicious of busts of engravings that were not cut from photographs. I mean, he did have a favorite engraver, John John C. Butler, who was anti-slavery, who most of the engravings Butler did were based on photographs, and he knew what Douglas wanted. They had actually a comparatively close working relationship. But Douglas also hated, there are a number of images of Douglas that appear in Frank Leslie's Illustrated with Harper's Weekly, the first illustrated weekly, and Frank Leslie's was far more racist. And Douglas couldn't do anything about it, other than continuing to speak and to protest against these racist caricatures.
Can I just say one thing before to sign off? We don't have time to talk about it, but there's interesting gender issues going on with the works that we showed, and the issues around Douglas and as opposed to these anonymous women, even Delia. So those are things that we'll have to explore in future conversations.
We should have a conversation part 2.
Even between truth and someone like who has agency. She controls the circulation of her image in the way that Douglas does, I think, brilliantly.
Well, I really thank the 3 of you so much, and also the team behind the scenes. Thank you all so much. It is the 6 o'clock hour in Eastern time, so it's like my unfortunate responsibility to close this down, although I have a feeling we could keep talking. I do want to just give a plug for some upcoming shows. Adrienne co-curated The Color of Anxiety, Race, Sexuality, and Disorder in Victorian Sculpture, which is at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, England, through February 26th. So if you happen to be abroad in England, go. Right, Adrienne? It's gonna please go. If you can't make it in person, however, please check out the volume that Adrienne co-edited that is associated with the exhibition, and it's titled Essays on Sculpture. And also at the National Portrait Gallery, we are so pleased to announce that John Stauffer's exhibition, One Life, Frederick Douglass, will open on June 16th and remain on view through April 21st of 2024. So you have plenty of time to see that, but definitely go in June because it is going to be a highlight of the summer. This exhibition obviously illuminates the legacy of one of the most important 19th century writers, speakers, and intellectuals through prints, photographs, and ephemera. And just listening from John's, kind of off the cuff, as well as prepared remarks, I definitely want to know more. John has a lot to say and has a lot of good arguments about Douglas and portraiture. And congrats to Jen for her recently published book. That was what inspired me to get this group together. And I just feel like, it's too bad we could keep talking. And I just thank everyone for their time.
Thank you, Kate, very much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.